Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. First, I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar, Overcoming Today's Top 5 Software Development Process Challenges with SCM. And at this time, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Chris Luca has experience in continuous integration and build systems, as well as an affinity for ramping up Agile teams. He brings both an active approach and deep knowledge of the industry to Accurev. Chris is a certified Scrum Master, and his experience dates back to his days as a build release specialist and a software engineer for IBM Rational. He has also filled the roles of developer, release engineer, and SCM consultant for numerous organizations. So with that, I'd like to hand over the presentation to Chris.
Thanks so much, Jen, for that introduction. Today we're going to be talking about top 5 process challenges and how they can be solved with SCM. I'm just going to go over the agenda today real quick. Today we're going to go over those challenges that organizations face as they introduce or scale a complex software development process. This can include Agile initiatives, XP things, best practices, anything that you're going to scale out that could be part of a complex software development process. We're going to talk about some of the obstacles that you're going to face and how to overcome them. And of course we want to talk about the role that an SCM system plays when enforcing and managing a software development process. We also want to look at the key attributes that SCM systems have that can make or break some of your process initiatives. And of course, at the end, we're always going to have time for question and answers. So let's talk about some of those top process challenges. You know, if I had to sum a lot of these challenges up, I would actually call them getting to done, which is actually completing or finishing a item of work in a software development process. And a lot of those problems kind of stem from workflow and traceability of either stories or requirements or issues or bugs. We really want to talk about how we manage the workflow of those items as they kind of flow through a software development process. We want to talk about some of the challenges you're going to have with branching and merging for that process. So what kind of branching patterns or merging patterns do I use to kind of enforce a process that's going to help me get to done? We're going to talk a little bit about colocation, supporting geographically distributed teams, and the challenge of kind of supporting a remote environment versus some co-located environments. Now, if we're talking about software process, we always have to mention Agile here. I know many of you have some Agile initiatives out there. Some of you may be adopting some Agile best practices or not adopting others. So we want to talk about how you support Agile and non-Agile projects together. And of course, you want to bring up how do we integrate this with our existing tool stack. So how do we take our tool stack and go back and kind of support all of these challenges together and bring that all together in one, I would say, one solution that's kind of integrated together. So let's talk about why getting to done is important and why we kind of categorize those problems as a getting to done important. And when I talk about getting to done, I'm talking about finishing either a user story, a requirement, or an issue, and just kind of pushing that code out the door. And it's important to recognize that you need to clearly define what your definition of done is. Now, I know it seems silly that we should talk about this. Some of you are probably saying, well, done is just done. I just know when my code's finished. But it's really important to put that definition out there for your team. Defining done might mean for one team that it just compiles. For another team, it might mean that we ran all of the regression tests. One team might say that it means that QA signed off on it. It's really important to know up front what you're trying to accomplish, because if you don't, there's going to be some consequences. If you can't get to done, you're not going to be able to create a feedback loop. Now, if we think about software process in general, feedback loops are very important. Feedback loops tell us when things fail. They tell us when we made mistakes. If you don't know if you're done, if you don't know what those things you're looking for, there's no way to kind of demo those changes to stakeholders. There's no way to know if you're delivering value. So without that clear definition of done, you're not going to be able to create a feedback loop. Now, to digress a little bit, if we talk about Agile teams, I've seen some of our clients here at Accurev do something where they may carry over stories from one iteration to another. This is an example of not getting to done. All right, so they're not creating that feedback loop, and they're not knowing if they delivered value. So being able to finish that work item is very important. If you can't get it done, you're also going to destroy transparency. And that's, of course, going to affect the trust between stakeholders and developers. So if a team says that they can deliver a certain amount of work or a certain amount of requirements per this development cycle, and they don't, the stakeholders are no longer going to believe that that team can deliver on their promises. So being able to clearly set that definition and know what's happening, it really will affect those teams. Now, undone work, now what we're going to talk about here for a second, accumulates technical debt. And what I mean by that is every time you release software, you're always going to have work that you don't finish. You're going to have some of your requirements are going to be half done, and some of that code is going to end up in your repository and kind of pollute that repository. And that creates something called technical debt. For those of you that don't know what technical debt is kind of either doing something quickly to achieve a goal or not doing something the right way and kind of causing an effect later that might be a problem for you. So let me give you a good example. I always like to tell this story. Living in New England, it snows quite a bit here, and in the wintertime, we have to shovel our driveways. If I only shovel half of my driveway for the day, the other half will turn to ice later. That's technical debt. I quickly got my car out of the driveway, but now I'm going to have to spend more time getting that ice off of that driveway later, which is worse than my original problem. And this is a strong statement. If you're unable to master this concept of done, you just simply will not succeed. You will not be able to have a streamlined software process that's going to help you. So let's dig into this a little bit more. What are some of the challenges? And let's talk about the SCM system for a little bit. One of the big problems here is, of course, that when we think about our SCM system, we think about software configuration management. When we're developing software, especially at the rate at which we're developing software nowadays and the pace at which software development processes run nowadays, the code base is really only stable near the end of the development cycle. And it's really hard to stay stable during. Now, QA testers, of course, aren't really concerned about this. Say you check in a lot of code changes to trunk and you have a lot of undone work in trunk, so you have some code that developers are testing and they're trying to work on. That's going to affect the QA team, or there's going to affect your testers. And they really don't have a good place to just test completed stories. So they need a stable configuration to do that. So how do you manage that? Some people manage it by cherry-picking changes out of their mainline or creating different development areas to do that. But typically the most common problem is that developers will often delay committing changes to prevent breaking that build or breaking that baseline. All right? And that really leads to a problem where people can't even identify what's changed since the last time a build worked. Another problem that happens is people really have a hard time trying to keep the status of a story or a requirement or bug in sync with their code base. Now, if we think about this for a second, all of our issues, and I know all of us work in issue tracking systems or requirement systems, all of those issues are going to go through different statuses. They're going to be opened or closed or in progress. It's really not fair that we don't have a place in our code base to keep that in sync. So we constantly have code that's either not finished or in progress mixed in with code that actually is done. And speaking of that, how do we handle code that we partially completed but we know doesn't fit into that release cycle? So how do we actually pull that out? I know many of you may be struggling with a situation where you have to create entirely new branches of code and merge over all of your done work to that code to just get a release out the door. So how do we manage unfinished code that just didn't make it out the door, and kind of how it maps up to those issues in the issue tracking system we talked about before? And of course, another problem, how do we take remote development teams and how do we make sure that they're managed together, and we kind of take this process and bring it all together? So let's think about this for a second. I like to think of the process framework as involving three different things. We have program and project management, and these people are going to deliver value based on business and kind of feed that into some of the other things that we do here. We might have technical practices, which could include SCM best practices or Agile best practices, or just regular peer programming or code review. All those types of things kind of fit into that. And then we have, of course, supporting tools, which kind of fit into that process. And I always like to think of those supporting tools as tools that are actually going to help manage and enforce that process. Unfortunately, though, if we think about the industry today, it's more of a trickle-down approach where our technical practices and our program managers are kind of dictating how our tools work, and we're just hoping that our tools can kind of just do a good enough job to help support that. The way I really would prefer to think about it, or the way I wish it worked, and what we're going to talk about for the rest of the presentation today is how do we get those supporting tools to map, manage, and enforce some of these technical practices and these processes that we talk about here. So I'm going to use an Agile example here. Let's talk about how a software development process might work with a legacy or traditional SCM tool. Like I mentioned before, user stories, and for those of you that aren't doing Agile, maybe a requirement or an issue, will go through many phases while it's on its way to done. A user story or an issue might be in a to-do state, a development area. It might be being worked on. It could be coded. That's code that's ready for QA testers to test. Once it's tested, you kind of move it to done. And in Agile, we kind of use these things like a task board to move these user stories through this process. Now, the problem is that a lot of our legacy SCM systems are great for isolation, but they're not great for workflow. And what I mean by that is your SCM system right now is probably great for managing a very long, very isolated release process where you have one long branch that's being used for the 1.0 or the 2.0 release. But it's really not helping you with this workflow here. It doesn't match up to the way that you're actually doing software in practice. So what can we do about that? Well, we can kind of enforce some workflow and traceability. And the key here is, of course, to take some of these steps that we've used for our user stories or for our issues here, like this work in progress, coded, tested, done steps, and we're going to map that to a branching strategy. In Accurate's case, they call them streams. That's why it says streams here. But in this case, we might have different branches representing all the different states of the software development process. And there's a lot of benefits to this. If we're able to successfully map this out, we can wrap different types of processes around this. For example, my work in progress code here, which is all code that developers are currently working on, that could run some continuous integration. Now, we could run different types of continuous integration, all of these different code bases. I could run maybe a simple compile for the developer code. I could run full regression tests for the QA code. I could run different unit tests for all the tested code. And that process could be mapped out and automated in a way that's really going to help you get through this workflow. Now, this can easily be automated with any SCM system. It's been done many times, and this is just kind of a way that I want to show you conceptually how that's actually going to work. And of course, here we're going to produce our product, and that's going to go out the door. We're going to see all the different user stories or the tests or the requirements that have made it out the door for that particular issue. So the idea here is that we're really only going to move code that's ready to be moved to the next state when it's actually done. And we're going to follow that process as it moves through this workflow. So you're probably saying to yourself, that's great, but I work with files and directories, Chris. How do I manage those files, and how do I manage those directories through that branching structure? And what you really need to do is be able to manage it kind of on the feature level. And some of the challenges with what I just showed you are you're not going to be able to manage it on the feature level if you're just using files and directories. You might know what you planned, but you don't know what people are really working on. You might not even know where those features are in that code base. You might have to go back and make an Excel spreadsheet out of your commit log and try to look at user comments and developer comments to see what they've checked in and what they've done. So really trying to manage that at the feature level and find that traceability is key. So just like what I was talking about, that linkage is massively overlooked. So the linkage between user stories or requirements and the code that's actually changed is often overlooked. All right, so you need to know where the location of all those code changes are. And this process needs to be automated and seamless. So it just needs to work. It just takes one bad, comment on a commit line to kind of screw this up. So I know many of you may have triggers in place where you have set up a trigger where a developer has to commit and enter an issue number when he commits code. as you all know, if he just puts in 1, 2, 3, 4, that can kind of trip up this entire process. And that's why that automation is very important. It needs to absolutely be completely automated. If you don't have this, teams also won't know what's been completed. Teams need to be able to determine what features they're going to be able to test. They need to know what's fully completed and which ones are partially done. So again, we talk about that undone work that kind of can pollute your code base. You need to be able to have that linkage so that you can actually see what's been completed versus which stuff is currently in development or currently being worked on. So let's show you how to do that. In the industry, in the SCM industry, we actually have a term for this. It's called a change package or a patch or a change set. And what that means is I'm actually going to link my requirements or defects or user stories all in one place against some files or tests or something that's been coded in my repository. All right? And we can actually take that linkage, and what we can do with that is it's very powerful. We can actually merge by issue. We can merge by feature. We can follow that workflow that I talked about before if we're able to link those things together. All right? And that's really where that visibility comes into play there. With that, you can kind of produce a full product based out of really those change sets that we talked about. So let's switch gears for a second here. When we talk about software process, I know that we all have to deliver faster than we've ever done before. I remember back in the day we would deliver software once a year or once every 6 months. And nowadays we have shortened release cycles. We have iterations. We have maybe frequent or continuously integrated builds. And as you scale that process where we're kind of pushing code out the door faster, you're going to be in more integration pain than you were before. By integration pain, I'm talking about simply merging. I remember, and I'm sure many of you remember this, there is something that we would often refer to as integration hell or merge week. We would have, every 6 months when we released our software, we would have a week or 2 weeks or a month where we would actually spend time trying to merge our code base back to mainline. And of course, we'd have a whiteboard just like this that you can see here in this slide, where we would say, "Do not erase this. This is our development process. This is where we, this is how we know where to merge from and where to merge to." So my point here is that, in a modern, in a modern software development process, especially if you're doing Agile, you're going to be merging and integrating a lot more often. That merge hell is kind of expanded out over the course of one iteration or one development cycle. It's not just happening every 6 months or once a year now. And the thing here is that integration needs to occur across all your different projects, products, and releases. So now that we're even doing it more frequently, it's going to happen across any different development line that you have in place. If it's another release or another project, that branching and merging, of course, is going to follow that model that you're doing. And that's why your model has to be flexible. So let's get into this a little bit more. I have here, kind of a branching structure, if you will, of what a complex parallel development process might look like. You remember we talked about before, we have this workflow set up where we're going to have all these different states for these different branches set up in this workflow. We're going to perform continuous integration on all of these different states. So we're going to have to follow this process across multiple release lines. And the key to this is being able to have one process that you can follow across multiple release lines. The process can be exactly the same across whatever release you're doing here. And that's really the point of this. If you can have one consistent and repeatable process that your development team can follow for every release, you're going to be able to get to done faster and you're going to be able to deliver code faster. So the real trick to this, of course, is being able to design that process in your SCM system. All right, and this type of SCM process will allow for those workflows. You really want to take that whiteboard that we talked about and create a development hierarchy or a map that you can manage in the tool itself. All right, and of course, the key to this is being able to take completed code and push it from one stage to the next. Like I said, each time we move that code through each stage, the code is going to become increasingly stable as you move through that hierarchy. And of course, another thing we should talk about, and something else that can be easily scripted, is the automatic merging of done code. Imagine, if you will, being able to take thousands of files that you have been working on for this release and automatically merging any trivial merges to some of those other teams, especially when the code is just finished. That's really one of the most important things that you can have in one of these systems. So let's switch gears for another second. Let's talk about colocation. We hear a lot about colocation nowadays, and a lot of people are talking about it. So what's the big deal with colocation? For those of you that don't know, colocation is just a fancy term that means that we're all going to work together in the same office. And we've seen many different software organizations go about this in a different way, where they've actually brought people into one office from all different locations. They've torn down cubicle walls. They've set up meeting rooms. They've done all this stuff to kind of get their teams collated together. And what the big deal about colocation is that co-located teams are usually, especially if they're agile, are cross-functional, they're self-managing, and they really have everything that they need to get one piece of code out the door. They don't have to send any function out the door to another location to have them do it. And that means that each team is going to be staffed with developers, testers, doc writers, everything they need to get one piece of code out the door. You don't send code over to the QA team in some other location to kind of finish that. All right, and especially in an agile environment, this will help them to complete a story without going outside the team. It's all self-contained, and that's what the big deal about colocation is. There isn't really anything where you're dealing with different organizational structures to that point. All right, and that's why it's imperative you have a way for these people to communicate effectively. And when I talk about communication, I mean all sorts of communication. This could mean IM or instant messenger or integrating code with one another. This really is tying it all together in a way where they can truly be co-located and they can actually work together in a way that is in a high bandwidth situation. And like I just said, that communication includes all types of information. Now, one thing I'm willing to bet, though, none of you on this webinar right now have the ability to snap your fingers and all of a sudden co-locate your teams. I'm pretty sure that we live in a world right now where co-location is certainly a goal. I'm not saying co-location is bad, but what I'm actually saying is I think we can do remote development better. So this is really the reality of co-location. We may have different teams set up in different locations. If you'll notice here, I have developers in Kiev and Boston. And I have architects and product managers in San Jose. I might have testers and doc writers in Chennai. And you'll notice that the bandwidth is different between all these teams. Some of them are able to have high bandwidth communication between them. Some of them can't communicate at all. Maybe they don't have all the resources that they need. Maybe some of these teams even have video conference systems. It's all different from where they're located. And I think really the key here is to kind of try to improve on that. So how do we improve on managing remote and geographically distributed teams? The trick here is to make sure that these teams can support one process that can be used across all different groups. You really want to make sure that all developers can appear to be co-located. You want to be able to have the appearance and all the information communication that they're going to need to utilize the same process with lower complexity. And that means that all developers have to be able to see and integrate all their work with their remote teams on a real-time basis. That means if a developer at one site checks in work to a particular branch, the other teams can see it right away. We don't want to send mastership back or forth or send packets of information back and forth and sync later. We really want to bring these teams together in a way that they can work in real time and kind of bring that process together. You want to have a full, consistent process that people can comply to. Having a process that you can follow across multiple teams will, of course, increase trust. I often say it's easy to blame another team that you don't see, especially if they're following a different process. You can kind of say, oh, the team in Chennai or the team in Boston didn't complete their work. It's their fault. But being able to have that process consistent across teams will really increase that trust. one of the great things about having an automated process like we kind of talked about with those branches is that having it visual is really the key. Being able to have teams see into the process, call each other out, keep each other aligned, and having the process be fully visible to everybody will really help you self-manage that process. And of course, it's going to reduce time slicing for everybody. They don't have to go into different project management tools to see different statuses for different teams and that types of stuff. So let's switch gears even again. Another trait to solve some of these process problems is SCM systems nowadays also need to be able to integrate with many different types of tools. If we're going to be using our SCM system as a process management type of tool, it's going to need to be able to integrate with agile project management tools, different types of issue tracking tools, and of course it's going to need to help support build and deploy tools and automated test tools. These are all the things that you're going to need to integrate together with your system. When we talk about scaling different process initiatives, and I know many of you are in this situation now where you may be adopting some agile practices, but not all of them. When we talk about agile practices, if you want to have continuous integration running, or you want to have demos or short iterations, you're going to have some tools to do that, but you're still going to have agile and non-agile tools mixed together. So integrating them both at the same time is a really powerful thing. So many of you are going to be in a situation where you're going to have a seamless workflow between agile and non-agile environments. And for those of you that don't know, this is called really a hybrid process. And if you're working in that type of environment, it's really as you kind of roll out that process improvement, it's really going to take a long time, or you're going to kind of be in that hybrid model. So how do we mix those teams together? I've shown you how to work through an agile process, through this workflow, but how do we take an agile and a non-agile process and kind of mix that together? So you can see that I have this workflow set up here where I have the backlog and the sprint and all these different states set up. And that's really where my agile team is going to work. Maybe that team's in San Jose, and that's that web team. They're working through that process. And maybe they release software every week. All right. So they can push their code through those different states. They can merge their code between those different branches, and they can push code out there once a week. But I might have another team here, the mobile team. This team could be in a hybrid situation. This team is doing some agile practices, but not all of them. But you'll see their process is slightly different. They have a code review stage in there before they can even pass the code off to QA. All right, but you'll notice that I've created a common integration point. You can set this up through different branching mechanisms in your SCM system, where we're going to have these different teams kind of come together at a common integration point while still managing their process. Here I have a traditional team. They're in Kiev, and they work in a slightly different process. You'll notice they have an integration step or a test step. They have user acceptance testing, and they might move slower through that process. They could release every year, but they still have that common integration point where we've shared code that's only done with each other before we push it out to production. So it's kind of important to have that integration step between all those three teams before we push that out to production, and kind of give that a multi-stage continuous integration type setup here, where you can see that we have different types of automation set up for those teams. So I think it's important to not think of SCM, and if you were listening to me before, I was talking about how SCM is kind of a supporting tool where it's going to kind of support some of those processes that we talked about. But I think that SCM should be an enabler and not really a roadblock. It's actually something that's going to help you kind of enforce and map that process. And these are just some of the key attributes that you have to look out for. These are some of the things that you're going to have to do. You're going to have to have full traceability across the development cycle. We talked about this before. You're going to have support from multiple teams in a parallel development. That's really one of the core strengths of having an SCM system that can help you with this. Coordination and communication with remote teams. And of course, that multi-stage continuous integration automation support that we talked about, where different teams are running different types of automation as you work through that process. And I think that's a really important thing to have. And of course, you have to be able to integrate and support Agile and non-Agile tools, as you kind of ramp up if you're doing Agile, or if you have some teams or some pilot teams that are kind of managing that. Now, I really think at its core, SCM system is more than version control. I know a lot of us think that software configuration management is really just version control. But software configuration management is really the practice of managing change. It's managing change throughout the organization. It's managing that process. And if you have a good SCM system, if you have a good workflow like we talked about today, you can do many other things. You can have a visual process automation that goes with this. You can see where in the process your code actually lives and where those user stories and requirements live in that process. Another thing you can do is change management. You can actually manage those artifacts and that change as you work through that process. And a great SCM, administrator or someone that's managing software configuration management in this way can have all of these things. They can have best practices for Agile or parallel development or globally distributed teams, and that kind of wraps it all up together in one kind of neat package, if we could, if I will. So that's pretty much the end of my presentation. I'm going to open this up for some Q&A questions here. We're going to have Jen look at some of the questions here.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Chris, for the presentation. And as Chris said, we are going to take a couple of questions now that have come in throughout the presentation. You can also enter any questions that you have now by going into the question area of the GoToWebinar console. And the first question that we have is actually a number of people have asked whether or not the presentation will be available after the session. The answer is yes. We have recorded today's session, and we'll send out a link to everybody shortly. And another question that we've received, do each of the steps in the process shown in the presentation represent a distinct software environment? In other words, is work in progress, done, test, and production equate to 4 different software environments?
That's a great question. Not necessarily. They could. In this case, I would say that it correlates to an environment if you need to. A lot of times, some of the ways I advocate doing it are some of the states will correlate to an environment. So obviously, I'm going to have a test, which is a QA state. That's going to correlate, of course, to an environment that QA testers need to test in. So that should everything that a QA tester needs to produce a test. But in some stages, you might not need one environment. So if we think about the WIP state, which was the development area, there is going to be multiple developer environments that correlate with that area. There could be hundreds, depends on how many developers you have. So there really isn't a one-to-one correlation. You could certainly model it like that, but it doesn't have to be. For example, you could add a code review state in there and have a branch that's just used for code review. There's no environment that goes with that. So yes, you could, but there is, there's a slight variance in there, but you can't have one environment if you want to, or you can kind of mix it up in the way that I put it in there. So yeah, I think that answers that question.
Great. And another question is, how do you handle streams running concurrent sprints that are of a different time box?
Great question. If we're talking about streams, certainly in the accurate sense of the term, one of the great features of streams is something called automatic merging or inheritance. Teams. Okay, so if we're talking about teams running in different concurrent time boxes, the real trick here, and I think I showed this on one of the slides, is to have that workflow set up in such a way that there's a different branching model for each team. We talked about getting to done and delivering to done, and what I'm really talking about is really only check in and promote code through that process when you know it's ready to move on to the next stage, which means that when those teams are actually done with their particular, if they're in a time box of 2 weeks, and you're with another team that's delivering code every 3 weeks, once the code is finished out of that 2-week iteration, you kind of want to merge it over to the team that's working in the 3-week iteration. So you really want to have 2 separate branching structures for those teams. And that's really kind of how we modeled it there.
Thanks, Chris. On the slide where you show the web team, mobile team, and database team merging into one, how is that possible with different time frames? Does this mean phasing the development such that the DB is done in advance?
Interesting question. So, you know, obviously in that scenario, the DB team may actually be working on an entirely different workflow. Especially if we have two different, you know, as we all know, the database team, especially we're talking about a database team that might have a dependency on some web applications. You might want to have several different web teams working on their own iteration cycles on, you know, whatever time box they want to work on, and the database team might actually have a completely different sprint cycle, and that's something that we've set up before for some other clients, is to actually advocate that there's kind of a give and take and a play between some of these Scrum teams if we're in an Agile environment where you know, there may be a Scrum of Scrum, there may be user stories created between some of these teams, and that's really how we kind of advocate doing that. On a strictly configuration management level, it's always you know, it's always going to be a challenge, I think, to have especially database teams, you know, stay in one place when they code. That doesn't mean that the database code is always done before they merge, but you know, the database teams are always going to have to be able to, you know, kind of merge between different releases, if you will, and that's kind of how you're going to manage that.
Great, thank you, Chris. And would you please help to shed some light on the best practices for inter-project code merges? What specific capability or processes built into AccuRev can help to facilitate a merge with minimum effort or errors?
Wow, great question. You know, one of the great things about AccuRev is AccuRev provides you with a way to actually merge completed code with another team automatically. Now this, of course, doesn't include code that could have conflicts. So, you know, if I were to merge hundreds of files between two teams, AccuRev would really only ask you to merge the several files that could have conflicts, and that could be, you know, depends on your type of project and what you're working on. But, you know, if you only have 10 files that have a conflict, those are the only ones that are actually going to show up in an AccuRev merge. You do not need to download or, you know, compare two entirely different code branches between those teams. So that's one of the great things AccuRev, that's where AccuRev actually really shines, is helping two separate teams working in parallel deliver code back and forth to each other with a minimal set of merges there. It's really just going to automate a lot of the process for you.
Great, thanks, Chris. The production certification of the code is typically not provided by the SCM or development teams. How does this approval get communicated for the packaged code?
Great questions. There's a lot of different ways to do this. There's certainly some commercial tools that you can get to facilitate this. If you're using a tool that helps you do production deploys or automate some of the you know, binary process out there, such as Anthill Pro or Electric Cloud, there often are sign-off and permissions between those different, you know, different code bases there that you're building. But another thing that I should bring up too is that if you have that linkage of the change package that we talked about before with the issues and the SCM system, it is possible to link it in such a way where that when you promote code from you know, one environment to the next, you're actually required to sign off on that code or send an email to someone else who's going to approve it. So that can kind of help you manage that process in that way, where you're actually going to be updating fields in an issue tracking system right out of the SCM tool to say, hey, I'm ready to move. I think I'm ready to move my code to production. Let's email all the stakeholders on that chain to see if they're ready to accept that promotion, and kind of go back and manage it that way. And that'll allow you to, you know, you can kind of set permissions on that so that you can, you know, finish that once they've had their approval process set up, or once they've approved the production release, I should say. Sorry, I misspoke.
Great, thanks, Chris. We're just sifting through questions. This is sort of a follow-on question. With regard to the merge question, does this mean features can be merged across branches without having to merge all of the changes?
Yep. So I think that depends on how your code base is set up, of course. But there's two things here to remember. If you're using a change set or a change package, you can certainly pick one feature or one issue, buy that issue, and merge it to another branch. Now, does that mean that that code doesn't rely on another piece of code that went with another issue or requirement? It could, but in AccuRev's case, we'll actually know if that dependency happened. So if someone else checked in some code that was related to the code that was part of your feature, if you both worked on foo.c and they both contain two features, both features are going to have to go over, or you're going to have to kind of reconcile and remove that feature from that code base. The other thing that I was talking about with automatic merges is that if we're merging over hundreds or thousands of files that are part of these features, all of those files are going to automatically make it over instantaneously, while only the conflicts are the ones that are going to be presented to you that you're going to actually be aware of. All the rest of it's automatically going to make it into the code base, while the other 3 or 10 or however many conflicts you have are going to be called to your attention separately.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And a quick question, is there a demo of the actual AccuRev tool?
Yes, there is, and you can find that on our website. And if you want, I'll send you an email afterwards, and we actually have weekly demos where you can, so there's 2 things. Either our weekly demos where you can sign up and watch a live AccuRev demo, or if you're really interested, we can have one of our experts give you a call and present a demo for you personalized. We'll follow up with you on an email on that one.
Great, and I think that wraps it up for the questions that we have today. I again want to thank everybody for attending today's session. If you have additional questions, feel free to write them in on the survey at the end as you close out of the GoToWebinar console. And please feel free to visit our website where you can find more resources on SCM. Thank you.